Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today to watch the film.
So first of all, I want to thank you very much to Dorot for this great program and for the creators for this movie, because I must tell you that this movie is very beautiful, very artistic, and all photos that I saw, I admired all the selection of photos, of videos, of voices, of people, and the plot is very moving. Sometimes I watch this movie, it is more interesting than a real movie. This documentary is more interesting than a movie.
Thank you.
Why it is vitally important for me, this movie? Because I'm Jew from Ukraine, and 2/3 of my family perished during the Second World War. And now I live in hostile environment in East Harlem. Believe me or not, but I have a yellow star on my door for a few years at this city building. And neither city authority nor police stretch hand to help me. That's why such movie is vitally important for me, because you bring me strength. You bring me strength to overcome anti-Semitism, which is flourishing now in our city. And I hope with this strength we shall overcome it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such high praise. It's very moving to hear that the movie helps you get through your difficulties now in these times.
Is there another question? Oh, there is.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I have two questions, and they're both about feelings on your part. You mentioned that you felt like this was about your parents and not you. Do you think it is because you are the child of Holocaust survivors that it's about them and not you?
I felt it was their story, not my story. But my feelings have evolved, and in the memoir, as I said, it is in first person, and it is very much about my story and my arc as I made the discoveries. And a sense of connection that grew and grew as I shared the discoveries. But it had also to do with my shyness. I was always asking questions professionally as a reporter, a journalist, for my readers and to be most accurate when I interviewed my sources. And that kept me out of it, and it kept me anonymous. And the need for anonymity was very great, because my mother, having survived in great mortal danger for quite a few years acting a role, did not want us to be exposed. When the moratoria marches were ongoing in the 60s due to the Vietnam War, we were not allowed to go. So I wanted to be in the background very much for much of my adulthood.
Somehow, these movies are always very difficult, I think, to watch. So thank you for creating it, because it's important and it connects powerfully. But there's the imagery of what went on at the medical school for your father struck me very much of similar images at Columbia University in the past I guess not quite 2 years. I identify with that profoundly. I wonder, having watched those images for a while in the production, do you have that same feeling about it, or do you feel disconnected between the past and the present? Because you've been so involved in it, I'm interested in whether you have a different view.
I feel deeply connected with the protests on campus, and unfortunately the film is even more relevant, and the discoveries that I made became even more and more relevant as I made them. In the memoir, I talk about when I saw the movie Julia, which I went to see really at the time that it came out, and I understood that the sequences that we showed here in this film were supposed to be at the University of Vienna, and I of course knew that my father was a graduate of the University of Vienna Medical School. But I had been told something inaccurate by my mother, who was rarely inaccurate. I think there are 3 times in everything that she told me, or in the testimony, that anything was slightly off. And the mistake that my mother made about my father's time in Vienna was that she misremembered when he left. She thought that he had taken his oral exams very dramatically in a taxi on the way to the train station during the Anschluss and had gone home back to Wuf. So when I was watching Julia, I thought, oh, well, this is not relevant to my father because he left. He left unscathed and he didn't see all this. But when I searched for my father's name, David, as we show in the film, and up popped this equivalent of the Nacional that I had in my mother's files that she saved, and I investigated his time on campus, I learned that he did in fact graduate in June of 1938, so he was there throughout the Anschluss. And then I began to try to be in his shoes and imagine what it was like for him as a Jew to witness that. And I asked the historians at the University of Vienna where Hitler's parade, of course I'm now thinking of military parades, where Hitler's parade had gone along the Ringstrasse and had it passed by the university, and actually they couldn't tell me. So way back in 1978, I did not make a connection between the violence because I knew nothing about my father's past, as I said, or his education.
I was just wondering if, as a journalist and filmmaker, you had planned to write about your parents' lives, or it was really spurred by this great treasure trove of documents and photographs that you inherited.
I tried to write about this and to research this in every decade of my adult life. The collection was brought home in 1968 when I was still a kid, really. You know, I was just about to turn 13, so teen. And I lived with them. And I remember my mother creating the albums, which are becoming very frayed, and trying to put things in a logical order. And I think, and when the portrait, I remember mainly the portrait of my grandmother Teofila and my great aunt Lutza as young girls. That was the main portrait that I would stare at the most. And I think it's because at that point my mother, who also stood before that portrait the most, claimed that I resembled her mother. And I don't know if that's really so. There's an ongoing debate as to who I resemble, but I was very involved in the family past because of those images that I lived with, and the activity of trying to make sense of all the photos that my mother. I sat with my mother a lot, and she didn't label stuff, you know. So I was always trying from memory to figure out who was who. The first time that I tried, I'll just say briefly, the first time that I tried to write about my family's past was when I was taking a screenwriting class at the New School, and I was in my late 20s, and I wrote about a fountain in Vienna that was my father's favorite place to go as a medical student. And when we went to Vienna in 1960 or 61, he delivered a paper on infertility. He was an infertility expert. It was a great triumph for him to return to that city and give that speech about his research in infertility. And he brought us to the University of Vienna. So we had the footage of the university steps that we should, you know, my sister Michelle and I. And I started this script with the first time that I saw the Donnerbrunnen, his favorite fountain. And I was 5 years old, and my father made a joke. This is also in the memoir. He said, this statue, it was a statue that was leaning over the rim. And I didn't know at the time, and even until I researched it, for the book and the film, that this statue, this bronze statue, Baroque statue, was trying to spear a salmon in the pool. But my father said, after all these years, he still hasn't gotten in. And I said, Daddy, it's a statue. But what does that mean? My father, I said, didn't really talk, but that was a very big statement, not being able to get in. And so, the process of researching this, I understood things in a different way.
Have you discovered anything new since this movie was in the can?
We did make discoveries during post-production, and I had postponed them. The first one was of my uncle Milek, my father's younger brother, who did not survive. And it had occurred to me that since my father had a nationale from the University of Vienna, there might be an equivalent type of file about my uncle, who I knew was a graduate of what is now Lviv Polytechnic, but was then Lvov Polytechnic. And I had only seen one picture of my father's little brother in the family portrait that you saw of the 5 of them. So I said to Alex via email, please go and check the archives of the Polytechnic. I want to see what my uncle looked like as an adult. And maybe there's a file on him. And, a couple of weeks went by, and I said, what's going on? And he said, well, there's this apparatchik who doesn't want to get the file, but I know it's there, and I'm going to hold this archivist to it, and she's just being a bureaucrat. So there were other ways that they stole, but anyway, I got the photograph, and there was indeed a file, and it turned out that I had made some assumptions about what happened to my family during the Soviet occupation that were false. So first, in terms of the photo, you know how the woman in gold is looking out the window and she turns to her nephew and she has tears in her eyes. And she had expected, having reacquired the painting, that it would make her feel better. When I saw the photograph of my lost uncle as an adult, with beautiful eyes, light eyes, very handsome, with a narrower face than he had as a little boy, he so resembled my father that I was taken aback. And it was extremely painful, both because I saw him with the hopeful eyes of a newlywed in love, expecting to live out his life, and the resemblance to my father just made it so clear that my father and he could have switched places. My father's fate could have been Milek's fate. And it did not make me feel any better at all, as the woman in gold did not feel any better at all. The second discovery was that I had put off, was that we were always looking for visuals to cover any audio edits. And I needed to find out what this handsome Nazi that my mother described as so incredibly handsome, the murderer who shot people randomly in Tarnow. I needed to know what he looked like, and we needed to show what he looked like. And I didn't want to interact with the German state archives, but I did finally, and they were great. They got me the photo. It took a long time because that particular file was out for digitizing, but I got that picture that you saw and the application that Bruno made to become an enforcer in the Nazi infrastructure. And I was very disturbed by that because he looked to me surprisingly like Paul Newman. I was very bothered by it. And then I had this memory of asking my mother one day if she thought that Paul Newman was handsome. And she wouldn't answer me. So these connections are so unexpected and they're everywhere. And it's extremely weird and ironic because Paul Newman is half Jewish. So those were two late discoveries.
this is going to sound incredibly weird, but it's so lucky. I feel that you're so lucky that you found that you got those records. And I think you're lucky because you have the personality and the profession of a researcher, so that, meaning that all of those archives are not sort of weird places where you don't know quite what to do with them. And I felt that all through watching the film, and I've seen it several times, that how interesting it would be for all of us, for me for sure, not to try to find things. And if we were as lucky as you, because I do see part of finding those kind of records and being able to paint the kind of pictures that you were able to. I'm not saying they were lucky, I'm saying that you were lucky in that making of this film, in both your personality, your profession, your curiosity, and your talent, but they had to be, all of them, that allowed this kind of exposure of person after person who came alive for us, and who movingly came alive.
I myself felt that I was incredibly lucky as I made these discoveries. But lucky isn't quite the right word in a way. Sometimes I felt that my quest was, and magical is not quite the right word either, but as I began to find so many unexpected things, as a newbie in this, archival research, and also asked the right questions to ask Alex and the other researcher and other researchers in other archives, I did feel that it was meant to be that I would make these discoveries, is how I would put it. And I was extremely driven to leave no stone unturned, which is how my mother often spoke to us as children when it came to our studies. And my father was also very demanding academically. There was a tremendous emphasis on accomplishment and making something of yourself and making a contribution. My mother actually, though, was behind this in another kind of way. She was dissatisfied with the oral history tape. So were my sisters and I. And when it was done, she said, maybe you'll do something with it someday. And so, in those decades where I kept trying to approach, even before she did her oral history, but when I tried to approach this story, especially in the later decades after that recording was made in 87, I kept thinking, what can I contribute? So much has already been written, so much has already been said, and that is part of the reason why I couldn't rest. I had to find a way to tell both my parents' stories and honor the lost, and then complete the story of my grandfather, which I had a skeletal outline to, the one who survived.
What were the difficulties in making this film?